Alright, so if you've been watching my channel for a while, then you are probably already well aware of my position on the war on drugs here in the United States and around the world, and it is essentially that it has been an abject failure for the entirety of its existence. It is something that was explicitly started for political reasons, specifically to target black communities and anti-war coalitions under the Nixon administration, and since then has done absolutely nothing to actually address drug problems here in the United States. If anything, it's made it worse, and also has not done anything meaningful to reduce violence or the power of some of these drug cartels or gangs as well. And so that's basically been my take, is that we should end the war on drugs, regulate, tax, decriminalize a lot of these drugs as well, and basically undercut a lot of the power that these cartels have disproportionately in Latin America. But even with that take, and even with the basic historical facts that we can get into here, it seems like there are still a lot of Republicans, and some Democrats for that matter, who still think that not only we should continue the war on drugs, but that we should make it into an actual, literal, direct war. Okay, so here we have specifically Dan Crenshaw from Texas, although again, he is not the only Republican I have heard give this take. But here we have Dan Crenshaw essentially on Fox News suggesting that we should amp up the drug war to the point where we are literally getting into direct firefights and bombing these cartels in Mexico. Okay, so let's just go ahead and jump into this clip here. There is so much to say about this.
He has his own ideas and worries about what's happening at the border. This one might need to involve the U.S. military. Congressman, good to see you. Maybe explain what's got you very, very concerned.
Well, look, we recently introduced AUMF, an authorized use of military force against the cartels and any other organizations that traffic fentanyl specifically. So why now and why not years ago? These Mexican drug cartels have been around for a while.
Okay, I just want to make it explicitly clear here for you guys, okay? He is proposing Congress passing an authorization for the use of military force, an AUMF, the same thing that got us into the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He is proposing giving that military authority and power to the Biden administration, or to the office of the presidency generally, to directly go and fight Mexican drug cartels without even the permission of the Mexican government. Okay, that is what he's essentially proposing, invading Mexico, or doing, I guess, flyby bombing raids on these drug cartels. Okay, completely fucking insane.
But the difference now is fentanyl. This is not a drug problem. This is not a war on drug problem. This is a poisoning problem.
It's not a war on drug problem, as I'm advocating for literally going to war over these drugs and the flow of, specifically, he's focusing on fentanyl. Now, I think that it's important to bring up why generally we've seen the rise of fentanyl, which is a very serious problem with people overdosing on that here in the United States. Obviously, we have tens of thousands of people who are overdosing on that, but part of the reason we had this dramatic rise in fentanyl is, number one, it's much more potent, it's much more addictive and all of that, but we had this massive crackdown years ago during part of the height of the opioid crisis here in the United States, which was perpetuated and instigated by Big Pharma, and specifically the Sackler family back in the day, who have not faced even remotely close to enough consequences for what should be considered genocidal criminal actions for them pushing the opioids on the American people. But part of the reason we got the rise of fentanyl is because we had a massive crackdown on the pain medications here in America, and essentially that pushed a lot of people who were having problems with addiction with opioids and push them to the black markets, where then you start to get things that are laced with fentanyl, and then you have this massive explosion and the rise in people who are addicted to fentanyl, or who are taking pills or other sorts of drugs that are laced with fentanyl. But again, the key part there is that the major risk here, the danger here, is that people are getting a lot of these drugs on the black market, and sometimes you don't even know what it may be cut with. Okay, so the problem, the main problem, is that it's on the black market, that we do not have oversight, we do not have regulation, we do not have the ability to actually, get a firm grip on what is actually going on here. Okay, so the answer to that, you would think, would be, again, decriminalizing, taxing, and regulating these drugs, right? And that doesn't mean legalizing it so that you sell fentanyl to people on store shelves or anything like that. It just means giving people the ability to have access to things like addiction services, universal addiction services, mental health care, healthcare in general, making sure people have stable housing, stable economic situations for themselves and their families. Those are the types of things that you would generally do to try to ameliorate some of those problems. But instead, he's like, nah, we should double down on this black market approach, continue criminalizing them, continue throwing people in jail, and creating a mass incarceration state during the war on drugs, and throwing who knows how many untold thousands or millions of people behind bars to perpetuate that cycle where they get out of jail and then continue to be, put in a position where their life is in precarity and they go back on drugs and things like that. This is the cycle that he is proposing that we double and triple and quadruple and quintuple down on. Okay, this is Dan Crenshaw here for you.
And they're killing about 80,000 Americans a year. And the Mexican government does very little to thwart this. And I think there should be bipartisan efforts in Congress to pass an authorized use of military force to deal with them. If anything, that simply gives our president more leverage when trying to get the Mexican government to do its job. And that's its job on.
Okay, so basically threaten the Mexican government with an invasion or a military bombing campaign if they don't comply with what we want them to do with the war on drugs? Okay, man.
Thwarting immigration, which the cartels also control, and thwarting fentanyl coming north across our border and killing American citizens. These people are a lot more like ISIS than they are the mafia. You recently saw a war in the state of Sinaloa after the Mexican government arrested El Chapo's son. These cartels can actually battle close air support. They're battling government helicopters. This looked a lot like Mogadishu. It looked a lot more like Mogadishu than it does your typical organized crime.
I'm sorry, I gotta pause it here, right? He is making analogies to our wars in the Middle East, and this is so perfect for one major reason, because this is actually a good analogy to draw, especially when it comes to Iraq. And he actually just compared these cartels to ISIS, which, okay, man, I mean, I think there's a little bit of a disagreement there. ISIS is more ideological and, a religious-based thing. The cartels are more focused on business and just trafficking drugs. Whatever, put those, semantic disagreements aside about whether or not they're more like ISIS or the mafia. That's not the important part. The important part here is looking back at what led to the rise of ISIS, okay? Because I seem to remember this little thing called the authorization for the use of military force back under the Bush administration, which then allowed him to go invade Iraq under complete false premises and lies, okay, and topple the Saddam Hussein government, where Saddam Hussein was not a good guy by any stretch of the imagination. But what did that lead to? That led to a massive power vacuum opening up after we helped to disband their entire military. And then what do you get? You get, within that power vacuum we just created by knocking the head off of this government, you get the rise of ISIS, okay, which is so perfect for this argument that he's making. It's just self-defeating, and he's bringing it up as if it's an argument for his side. And he brings up the recent arrest of El Chapo's son, who I didn't actually get to cover on this channel, but that was a pretty big story, right? You have this massive explosion of violence, and the cartels are going and they're trying to, break him out, and they're attacking Mexican military forces and civilians as well. Horrible situation, right? But what does that tell you? Okay, because we already had El Chapo removed from the picture, then we had El Chapo's son removed from the picture, and what happened? You had, again, a power vacuum open up, and then you have an increase in violence and instability within these regions. Okay, so the lesson there from ISIS and from these drug cartels and the El Chapo family, right? The lesson there is that constantly trying to chase your own tail and knocking the heads off of these cartels does absolutely nothing in the long run to address some of the core problems. But he brings this up as if that's somehow arguing in his favor. It's just remarkable.
Crime battle. These people are well equipped. They set up forward operating bases that are well armed right near our border, and they're extremely dangerous. They're some of the most capable, most well-funded, most dangerous organizations on the planet, and they're right there. And
I want to just pause on a word there that he just said. They are some of the most well-funded organizations on the planet. Dan Crenshaw, where do they get their funding from? Okay, could it be that they're making their money by trafficking these drugs to other countries like the United States, right? I mean, he brings up the funding mechanism. Their funding is only able to be done because we have this massive multi-billion-dollar black market industry for them to profit from. Okay, you take that away from them by legalizing or decriminalizing, taxing, and regulating some of these drugs, and then you're taking away their business, okay, and draining some of those funds. You are defunding some of these cartels, if you want to use that word, okay? So again, he just slips a lot of these things in here, and he doesn't ask any simple basic follow-up questions, right? They're some of the most well-funded organizations. Where are they getting their money from? Santa Claus? No, they're making their money because we have a giant black market for these drugs, okay? But he continues.
And Mexico is at risk of becoming a failed state. We have to work together with their government to deal with this. I'm
curious, I wonder what Mexico would think of American troops at the border doing this cartel line of attack. They might interpret it differently. What kind of reaction have you gotten?
Well, look, we've always had trouble getting the Mexican government to work with us. And you compare it to a country like Colombia. So we've been dealing with Colombia for decades. America was very involved throughout the 90s in the cartel wars there, and then throughout the guerrilla wars. We called it Plan Colombia. And it was a very successful operation. It's made Colombia into what it is today, which is a much better country than it was 20, 30 years ago. The Mexican government has...
All right. I'm going to go ahead and cut it off there because I cannot take any more of this guy. But we're going to go back to that point that he just made there about Colombia, because again, I think that's pretty revealing about what he's actually trying to propose here with prioritizing basically military force over strategies that we know would actually be successful, instead of just, again, going in circles trying to crack down with as much military might as you possibly can and getting absolutely nowhere. But we're going to get a little bit of a take here from the newly elected president, the first left-wing president in the modern history of Colombia, here in a second from Gustavo Petro. But I mean, again, just to emphasize the point here, this isn't just some fringe member of Congress who's pulling some shit out of his ass. Well, he is pulling some shit out of his ass, but he's not the only one who said this. I mean, we have seen this from the upper echelons of the Republican Party as well. Here from Donald Trump, or from the Washington Post, they say Trump weighed bombing drug labs in Mexico after he mistook advisor. Okay, so just classic Trump there. And also on top of that, Trump in DC speech calls for the death penalty for convicted drug dealers. Okay, so this is the trajectory of the broader Republican Party. It's not just, Dan Crenshaw or some fringes like Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever. This is the Republican Party baseline, essentially, is doubling and tripling and quintupling and, all of that down on the war on drugs. Okay, so this is how they want to approach this issue, which again has already been a demonstrable failure for decades. But I want to circle back around to his point there about Colombia, okay, because again, you have this newly elected leftist president, Gustavo Petro, down in Colombia, who might have some, insight here in terms of how effective the U.S. partnership militarily with the previous far-right, in many cases like fascist governments within Colombia, and some of our military partnerships there and how well that has gone for the people there. So here from France 24, they sat down and did an interview with him. Colombian President Gustavo Petro, the war on drugs was a failure. Okay, so what are they talking about here? He says, with a quote, "The party currently in power in Washington," he's talking about Joe Biden here, "is very much aware of the fact that the war on drugs was a failure," said Gustavo Petro, age 62, who was elected back in June of 2022. And he says the figures speak for themselves. 1 million people have died in Latin America because of it. Millions of people, in particular people of color, are either drug users or are in American prisons. And Colombia's left-wing president said that drug trafficking mafias are much more powerful than in the days of the notorious cartel leader Pablo Escobar. They are armies that control entire regions within Latin America. They have states on their knees. Okay, so he's saying they're more powerful now than in the days of the notorious cartel leader Pablo Escobar, who of course was removed from the picture. And then what do you have? You have a power vacuum that opens up. You have an opportunity for increased destabilization, increased infighting and violence between a lot of these cartels, and then it inevitably is going to grow over time. Okay, so the problem has been getting worse, not better. If anything, you could say we've stalemated somewhat, but the problem has not been progressing in a good direction, to say the least here. And again, this is directly from the newly elected president in Colombia. I mean, and he points out some important statistics here as well, right? I mean, 1 million people died in Latin America because of it. Millions of people, in particular, people of color, are either drug users or are in American prisons. And I can just give you a little bit of backup there in terms of here in the United States. I mean, we know how this war on drugs has unfolded here in the U.S. From PBS, they say 50-year war on drugs imprisoned millions of black Americans. And again, I'll remind you guys of this quote every single time that I talk about the war on drugs. Here from CNN report, aide says that Nixon's war on drugs targeted blacks and hippies. Okay, so just in case you have any doubt whatsoever that my position on the war on drugs, that it was explicitly political, that they did it to target the political opponents of the Richard Nixon administration at the time, here is directly from the mouth of one of his top advisors. They say one of Richard Nixon's top advisors and a key figure in the Watergate scandal said that the war on drugs was created as a political tool to fight blacks and hippies, according to a 22-year-old interview recently published in Harper's Magazine. So he said this back in like the 1990s, I guess. He said the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left, this is during the Vietnam War and all of that, and black people. Former Nixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman told Harper's writer Dan Baum for the April cover story published Tuesday. Okay, so this is not some random guy who met Richard Nixon one day. This is the domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, that we're talking about here. He says, "You understand what I'm saying. We knew that we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we fucking did." Okay? I mean, this is straight from the mouth of a top Nixon advisor, one of the guys who helped to usher in the war on drugs. And he's just full-throatedly admitting it. Yeah, it wasn't about, the safety of the American people. It wasn't about what's best for the American people or what would actually legitimately help to solve addiction problems or drug, overdoses in the United States. It was to target our political opponents. And, gonna say something radical here, gonna throw out a suggestion to you guys. That is still what the war on drugs is 100% about, okay? And guys like Dan Crenshaw or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump coming out and saying we need to execute drug dealers, or saying we need to invade or bomb Mexico, okay, or continue with these military security alliances and weapons transfers to some of these Latin American countries in order to somehow address the flow of drugs into the United States. They do not give a single solitary shit about actually addressing this issue in a meaningful way. And again, the ways that you would go about doing this, we know what you would actually have to do in order to end the war on drugs and make progress on this issue, right? The way you go about doing this is not by trying to continue a military stalemate with some of these cartels. Again, we've gotten the lessons. It's perfectly analogous. He brought up the analogies in the statement he was just making there on Fox News. ISIS, right? You have a power vacuum that is created when you topple the Saddam Hussein government, and then you get the rise of ISIS. You have a power vacuum that's created when you topple El Chapo or Pablo Escobar, right? You have a power vacuum that's created, and you have increased instability, increased infighting among the cartels, inevitable growth of the industry as we allow the black market here in the United States to continue flourishing, okay? So the way that you actually go about doing this is not by continuing with military campaigns or bombing the shit out of Mexico without even asking their goddamn permission. The way that you go about addressing this issue is by making sure that every single American has a guaranteed universal right to healthcare, number one, and that includes mental health care services, that includes general, primary care physicians, and that of course includes addiction services and some of these things like safe injection sites that we've seen spring up in places like New York City and around the world that have been demonstrable successes as well, okay? You go about this in a human-centered way, okay? You don't go about this centering military or police, okay, as if that's somehow going to solve the issue. We have a mass incarceration state here in the United States, okay? We have the largest prison population in probably the history of the world, but by far the largest on the planet right now, both in total numbers and by proportional estimates as well. So, I mean, all that we've gotten as a result of the drug war as we have currently been operating is a mass incarceration state, thousands of people overdosing on drugs with no legitimate help from the government to get them off of those drugs and, assist them on the path of getting their life in order, okay? And we have members of Congress like Dan Crenshaw who are just actively hostile to the idea of trying to approach this in a meaningful, human-centered way, okay? And, instead of using any of those other approaches with healthcare or addiction services or, legalizing, taxing, and regulating some of these drugs and taking away the market share of a lot of these cartels, we have motherfuckers like Dan Crenshaw and Donald Trump who are leading the charge and could very well be in serious positions of power in the future. Okay, so I mean, listen, this is not an issue where like Joe Biden or Democrats are like, magnificent or that they're significantly better, but we have made somewhat of a, progress in the right direction on this, specifically with mostly just marijuana. We have, I think it's a majority of states now that have legalized or at least decriminalized marijuana in the US. So that's progress on that direction, right? We're making marginal steps in the right direction. Joe Biden has indicated that maybe he might look into rescheduling or descheduling marijuana from the controlled substances list. So that's good as well. Hopefully he actually follows through and pulls that off, even though it's Joe Biden that we're talking about here. Okay, a drug warrior through and through, guy who helped write the 94 crime bill under Bill Clinton. So we know who Joe Biden is, but obviously, this is an issue where Democrats and Republicans have their flaws. It's just that Republicans are the ones who are openly coming out and saying, not only do we want to increase police budgets like Democrats, not only do we want to keep a lot of these drugs criminalized in the United States like Democrats do, but we want to take it to a completely absurd level and authorize the use of military force in Mexico to directly go to war and escalate the war on drugs to a direct military conflict.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying